Live from York, this is The Late Late Show with Christopher Vowles on Teachers Talk Radio.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight I'll be considering the role of narrative non-fiction as a primary education tool with teacher and researcher Dr. Emma Simpson. So join us as we explore history teaching at Key Stage 2, the role of narrative non-fiction in history learning, and translating research into practice.
Live from York, this is The Late Late Show with Christopher Vowles on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live on the Podbean app or desktop player. Just head over to www.podbean.com/LSW/TT Radio or search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TT Radio.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Sunday Late Show for what is, I think, my 50th show for Teachers Talk Radio. We began in the dark, claustrophobic days of the COVID pandemic with a handful of hosts, some jingles, and a vague notion that it would be nice to hear more from classroom practitioners about a teaching profession that seems to be rarely out of the headlines. For more than a week or two, and here we are today now, representing a profession that is delivering education in England and across the globe. Thank you for listening, whether you are sticking with us, recently joining us, or giving us a go for the first time from wherever you happen to be listening today. We've covered a lot of different angles on this show since 2019, ranging from the challenges of teaching chess, shaping a computer game curriculum, and creating a World Book Day £1 book, to delivering creative writing in prisons, making sense of Ofsted's various subject reports, and to what to expect when a Viking reenactment group turn up at your school to teach history. Let's hope the next 50 shows can bring us some more of the sector's perhaps more unique and unusual voices. Today you find me 4 days into the summer term, having enjoyed a lengthy and largely relaxing Easter holiday and ready for the challenges of the examination term, because when the moorland heather begins to bloom and the daffodils in the local woodlands have burst into their creams and golds, and cricket balls are flying off of cricket bats on the recreation grounds and public parks, then public examinations are all but upon us. I hope my students have managed to dedicate themselves to completing some worthwhile and productive revision while they have been away, which for me would probably mean about 4 hours of schoolwork a day across a 5-day week, for I have never seen any value in students spending their entire Easter holiday staring at their books or, more likely, the clock for hours on end. I hope my Year 11 students have spent some time refamiliarising themselves with their set poems, novel and play, and have continued working on some of the stranger reading tasks set on the Cambridge IGCSE First Language English paper. Similarly, I hope my Year 13 students have learnt enough quotations and drafted enough skeleton essay plans over the last 3 weeks to write with confidence on their tragedy texts, Othello, Death of a Salesman and Tess of the d'Urbervilles, and their crime writing text, Hamlet, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and When Will There Be Good News? In a surprising quirk of the national examination timetable this year, our Year 11 students will have completed 3 of their 5 written papers for English language and English literature by the evening of the 14th of May, and our A-level Aspects of Tragedy exam also falls on that same afternoon. As the first A-level exams approach, our students will be spending 3 or 4 evenings a week working on timed paper practice in many of their subjects, sharpening up their exam room technique, and getting some final words of advice in the few exam-free weeks that remain. Yet the college has also found the time amidst all this busyness to mark the final pilgrimage of Pope Francis, as his death earlier this week carries him ahead of us all to the upper room. Some of our former students are at the funeral in St. Peter's Square, and I'm looking forward to hearing their reports about this when I next see them. It was incredibly powerful to watch the events of the service unfold on TV between my Saturday morning lessons and see the juxtaposition of the world's most powerful individuals and the curious electors attending alongside the homeless, the peripheral, as Pope Francis put it, and the other thousands of people who had made the journey to Rome to pay their respects. The music and the preaching, of course, were wonderful, and the BBC coverage did much to describe and clarify the less familiar rituals and practices. I am minded that our last Late Show edition on the purpose of Catholic education in February was quite possibly the last podcast on Catholic education broadcast during the pontificate of Francis. Education, it seems, is constantly confronting us with last things as well as first things. I wonder what stories those who were there in Rome on Saturday will pass on to their children and their grandchildren about this historic event. In tonight's show, we will focus on how primary school children begin to understand one of those first things that was supposed to be one of those last things, the Great War, which of course subsequently became World War I. We probably all have a vision in our mind's eye of what World War I was like, whether it be shaped by the poetry of Brooks, Owen, or Sassoon, given definition by grainy early photographs and the gruesome, hurried sketches of battlefield war artists, or described for us in the prose fiction of Michael Morpurgo, or brought to life on the stage in the spectacular Warhorse production. I suspect many of us think we have a good understanding of what World War I was like for the men and boys who went off to fight, and for the women and girls who stayed behind. But how is that knowledge, understanding, and empathy of our forebears passed on to our young historians before they make the transition to secondary school? Well, tonight we shall consider some of these themes. It gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest then, Dr. Emma Simpson, to explore her research into the practice of employing narrative non-fiction as a teaching tool in the upper primary classroom and its wider implications for curriculum design and lesson planning. So we'll be considering, what do we mean by narrative non-fiction? What does the research say about its impact? And how might its benefits be effectively harnessed as schools and departments go about revising their curriculum plans? Emma is a primary school teacher with a PhD in education who is interested in how different text types, especially narrative, might be processed in unique ways and the impact that this might have on students' learning. Our conversation this evening grows naturally out of some of the discoveries she has made while conducting an experiment into the ways in which narrative non-fiction can support the development of history education at Key Stage 2 as part of her doctoral research. And I'm delighted to say that Emma joins us on the line now. Good evening to you, Emma, and thank you for joining us on Teachers Talk Radio, the home of education conversation tonight.
Hi, Christopher. Thank you for having me. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I wonder if we might start, Emma, by considering your route into teaching. Was it something you had always wanted to do?
Yeah, I think that from a very young age, I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher. I mean, I loved school myself when I was younger, all the way through school. So I kind of say it was my excuse really just to never have to leave school going into teaching. So I don't think there was kind of a definitive moment where I decided on that as a career. I think it had always been within me that I wanted to teach. So yeah, when I was at secondary school, I did some work experience in a primary school, and that kind of really embedded for me that that was the path that I wanted to follow.
What was it that appealed to you about primary as compared with secondary?
I think one of the things that I liked the idea of was being able to teach a broad range of subjects. I think that while I do have interests in specific subjects, I just enjoy kind of that just search for knowledge more generally. And I've always enjoyed as a teacher now being able to learn things myself as I come to teach them. There are so many unexpected and different things that we learn about in the classroom. So I think the idea of kind of embracing all of those subjects as a primary school teacher really appealed to me.
And which particular subjects do you have responsibility for in your current primary context? Are you teaching the whole range of primary subjects, or are you teaching a specific number?
Yeah, I teach the whole range of subjects, but I'm the leader of English and computing in my school. So they're the kind of ones that I specialise in at the moment.
And how do English and computing relate to one another?
Interestingly, they relate to each other obviously more and more in an increasingly digital world at the moment. There are many more overlaps now. And currently we're considering our English curriculum at my school and thinking about how we can actually adapt it to be more relevant to children growing up in this technological age. So obviously, traditionally, lots of our literacy is just written in children's books, and it's thinking about actually how to get them producing more digital literacies, and also in terms of reading comprehension, just understanding digital literacies, as that can be quite a minefield for children today.
And would you mind just giving us a bit of a sketch of the context of your current school setting, Emma? What are the students like? What's the local area like? How enthused are they by their studies?
I work currently in a one-form entry primary school, and we are very close to two grammar schools. So we have quite a few children, especially in year 5, where I'm working at the moment, who are working really hard towards their 11 plus. So we've got lots of very keen, eager learners in our school. We're a very diverse school culturally as well. We've got children from lots of different backgrounds, being in the centre of a city. So we've got a really interesting kind of diverse backgrounds, and the knowledge that brings to the classroom as well is always really interesting.
And how does the 11 plus then affect the way your school thinks about what it offers as students move from their primary education setting to their secondary education setting?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because really we don't offer any 11 plus tuition ourselves, but it definitely does impact the way that I teach and the type of kind of what we call mastery challenges that we offer the children. I think lots of it is about kind of thinking outside of the box and encouraging those kind of real deeper problem solving skills. So that has become quite a big part of our curriculum through having lots of students who are working in that direction.
Okay, thank you for that. And in terms of what you particularly enjoy about working with the older primary school children, are you able to say a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, I think I enjoy how dynamic it is as a job and how active. Every day is always different in ways that you cannot always predict at all. So that just makes it really interesting. I think with the older children specifically, I really enjoy the relationships that you can build with your class. They kind of become almost your little family at work. It's one of those things where if any other teacher says anything bad about your class, you can get very defensive. I can tell them off all day long, but anybody else? So I really enjoy building those relationships with everyone in the class and just watching them grow throughout the year. I think just a single year is such a huge developmental leap for children. So watching them grow through that time is amazing, and especially when you see the little breakthroughs that they make along the way that really kind of propel them through their learning.
So do you typically take a new group of students on each year then, or have you moved around with some of your year groups?
Typically I will take on a new group of students in year 5 each year. I have been down and worked in year 1 and different year groups for a little while. But typically in the school I'm at the moment, I kind of have all the kids coming through to me in year 5. So.
So you've been working in this primary school setting for a while, and you've enjoyed everything you've been doing by the sound of it in relation to that.
Uh-huh.
What took you out of the classroom then, Emma, to do some more work in education research?
I think I first became interested in research when I completed my BA. And at the end of my BA, my dissertation either had to be a literature review of research or I could complete a research project of my own. So I went for the research project of my own and just really loved it. I think I've always enjoyed experimenting in the classroom, trying out different techniques. I don't like to get too stuck in my own way of doing things. So I think I just enjoyed, I could kind of take this exploration to the next level by doing my research and really kind of delve right into exactly how what I was doing in the classroom was impacting learning. And I think taking it up, like in the classroom, you can try a new technique and you can think, oh yeah, that worked. The kids enjoyed it. They seemed to get a lot out of it. But I enjoyed really upscaling that to look at it with a larger amount of children. So you could kind of really get into, actually, is this having a wider impact? Is this something which is going to be beneficial across cohorts of children?
Thanks. And in terms of the research route you decided to take, because of course postgraduate research is not getting any cheaper as the years go by, what kind of challenges did you find once you decided to take that route?
It was tricky in terms of financing it, obviously, as something when you've been through a career in teaching and you decide to go and apply for something like a PhD. Luckily, I did manage to get some funding to complete my PhD, which helped out a lot. I think also getting into it as a teacher was a little bit tricky because I felt like I had to go back quite a bit to when I'd done my research before I'd become a teacher, and trying to kind of pull those ideas together and get a real rationale to present for why I wanted to do this. It was kind of having two heads at the same time, your teacher head and then going back to that kind of academic research head. So I think trying to combine all of that to apply for the funding and for the PhD was quite a challenge. But as I said, I was very lucky to be able to obtain some funding to support me through most of my PhD, and I did some supply teaching part-time as well to support me while I was finishing my research as well.
Yeah, I'm interested in what you say about this kind of intellectual mind shift that needs to happen as well, because of course, typically, I would suggest most education research projects tend to fall into that kind of social sciences category that does need a little bit of thinking about if you've come into education research from an arts and humanities background. Was that something you experienced?
Yeah, I think one of the key things for me was I feel like there's quite a distance between lots of the research that takes place and teaching as a practice itself. And lots of the research that is completed, there's lots of brilliant educational research out there, but lots of it is, as you said, very social science. It's quite interpretive in nature, and there are quite broad conclusions that come from it. And I think as a result of that, lots of teachers don't always really consider the implications of that research because the findings are quite broad. So I think it's interesting to kind of try and go in from a bit more of a statistical angle where you can kind of have more definite conclusions which can then be fed into teaching. So I feel like there's it's a bit disjointed, the gap between the actual research itself and educational practice.
Thank you. And what was it then, after you spent your time readjusting your mindset to deal with the arts and humanities switch to essentially social sciences. What was it that brought you back into the primary school classroom, Emma? What was it you were missing, or what was it you wanted to get back in touch with?
I think whilst I loved doing my research, I did miss the interactive nature of being in the classroom. Lots of the research outside of completing the actual research part itself was sat in front of a screen, dealing with the statistics. And whilst I did that, I wanted to keep myself grounded in the classroom so that I could have that kind of balance of having those two mindsets and keep bringing my experience as a teacher into bear on my research as well. So I think I did just really miss working with the kids and being active in that way, which is what made me want to go back into teaching again. And just, to have that balance between enjoying my research, but also having that teacher head, which I think impacted how I completed my research.
Thank you. And what do you think your academic research brought back to that teacher head, I suppose, once you returned to the primary school classroom? How did it impact your perspective or your practice when you were teaching your primary school students?
I think it made me a lot more analytical in many ways. I found it difficult then when I tested something new in the classroom, kind of not to go into too deep an analysis of exactly what I was doing and what factors might be impacting learning and how I could measure it. So that was a positive impact in many ways because it made me really think deeply about all of the small decisions that I made in a day that sometimes you just take for granted. Sometimes you just choose to do a lesson in a certain way, especially as experienced teachers, kind of just because that's something we've always done. So I think it was refreshing that it did make me question and think about my choices a lot more. And specifically in relation to things like choosing which texts to use in the classroom to support learning and actually how I was using those texts. So before it'd be easy to pick a book to share and share the book and that was it. But it made me kind of pause and think, actually, let's think more carefully about why are we choosing this book and how are we going to use it to impact learning.
And does it offer any opportunities for wider professional development in your particular teaching context?
I don't feel it has too much. There have been some opportunities, but they have been more on the academic side rather than within teaching. But again, moving forwards, it's something that I would like to focus on more is how to kind of really combine that teaching with the research and how to reach out to ensure that research is having more of an impact on practice through things like professional development.
And how about your colleagues? What kind of resource do you bring with that extra research background to your school that they might benefit from?
I think keeping in touch with the research is something that I do bring to school. Having an academic background, I still like to read research and explore things in that area, which sometimes is more, I think, closed off to schools. So I think offering that can help. And as I said before, whenever we introduce something new, I think I can support in how we analyse whether this is actually having an impact or whether it's not having an impact, because a lot of it in schools is when you introduce a new scheme or a new way of doing something, you kind of just settle into it and you think, yeah, the kids seem to be getting on with it. Let's keep rolling with that. So I think having that more analytical approach to actually, is this worth it? Is this having the impact? How can we measure that impact to decide whether what we're doing is really worth the time that it's taking us to implement it?
And what about your school management's view of the value of research? Do they have a particular angle on how useful it is to the wider school community?
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's difficult at the moment. I think education is such a busy place to be. that there's often not a huge amount of time is given to considering research and the angle that has on our teaching. So I think not a huge weight is given to research unless it is directly relevant to how we are working in that specific school at that specific time. So yeah, I'd say it's something which I'd like to try and push a little further, but in a heavily loaded curriculum, in an incredibly busy teaching world, I feel like research is not always given the time that it would be nice to give it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? If we go all the way back to Michael Gove's view of what teachers and teaching should be, he always had this line, of course, that we were in a master's profession. Do you think there is value in more of our colleagues having the experience of postgraduate research to bring back to the classroom, either while they're currently working in the classroom or perhaps taking some time out from school and coming back to it later?
Yeah, I think it could be hugely beneficial. I think the current situation is quite nice because it is nice to learn along with the children sometimes. It is nice when I teach a new topic in history or in science or in geography that I don't know much about, I can kind of be on almost the level with the children and begin to understand the processes that they're going through by not having that specialism. So there's that which is positive. But also I think having that background in research and those specialisms would hugely benefit. I mean, at the moment in a primary school, we all lead subjects. All of the teachers will lead a different subject. And it can tend to be that just when a subject's free, it's given to the new teacher who comes in. It doesn't matter whether that teacher has any specific interest in art and D&T. It's, oh, this one's going, you can have that. And I think that's where it would benefit to have more specialism and more teachers with a background in research to really bring a lot more to those subjects. So if in a school we're lacking in any teachers who have a real interest or experience in, say, art or D&T, then sometimes that curriculum for us won't be quite as strong because we haven't got that individual to lead the way.
Yeah, I wonder if there's something unique as well about being in that 11 plus context where I would imagine subject knowledge becomes perhaps that little bit more significant as students move into year 5 and year 6.
Yes, definitely. There is definitely a drive in particular areas of the curriculum that reflect that, and a drive towards certain thinking skills as well. It is about the problem solving and that very logical approach to things, I feel, a lot of the time, rather than having the creative, collaborative learning side so much.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that really thorough introduction, Emma. It's been really helpful in helping us make sense of the community in which you teach and the reasons for your movement from the classroom to the university room and then back to the classroom again. In the second part of the show, I'd like us to look a little bit more closely at the planning of your research, Emma, and how the pupils responded to different ways of doing their history learning, if that's okay.
That sounds great.
Fantastic. Here's Joe Fox with our news.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
As the summer term begins, so does exam season. So The Guardian has chosen to focus on the topic of access arrangements, in particular the idea of extra time. The piece begins with the stark fact that in England alone there are more than 600,000 of the arrangements and poses the question, how can schools keep up? The aim of access arrangements is to remove barriers and provide a level playing field for all pupils sitting exams such as GCSEs and A-levels, as well as other qualifications. But the article says that the numbers of pupils who now have these arrangements in place has risen significantly. According to exam regulator Ofqual, the number of approved access arrangements was up 12.3% on the previous year in 2023-24 at 625,000, but that pre-pandemic there were only 460,000 arrangements in place. Figures are rising in Scotland and Wales too. The increase may relate to an increase in anxiety and improved identification of pupils with SEND since the pandemic. The article goes on to outline the different types of access arrangements, including the use of smaller rooms, one-to-one invigilation, and the use of scribes or laptops, as well as extra time. According to Ofqual, in 2023-24, 3 in 10 candidates were awarded 25% extra time. The Guardian says it is of particular concern that in private schools the proportion of students with additional time is almost 42%, compared to 26.5% in state secondaries, and it questions whether this is evidence of some schools gaming the system. The article also highlights the additional costs schools face in supporting the arrangements, including extra invigilators at a time when budgets are already tight. Other issues include finding the extra space needed whilst running the rest of the school as normal. One school mentioned in the article said it had told admin staff to work from home for 6 weeks in order to make space. Full details, including comment from Ofqual, JCQ, unions and the Department for Education, can be found in the full article online. Schools Week reports that 79 schools have withdrawn from the Free Breakfast Club trial, with many citing inadequate funding. The Labour government in England announced 750 early adopter primary schools had opened this week, providing 30 minutes of free childcare and a healthy start for about 180,000 children. But Schools Week says 79 schools who were on a published list in February are now not taking part. One Academy Trust CEO said 2 of the Trust schools had withdrawn because it currently isn't financially viable, and that there was a funding gap that was considerable. Other head teachers who made comment in the article gave similar reasons for their withdrawal. The Shadow Schools Minister said the scheme was another chaotic and mismanaged announcement from the Department for Education, but the government said some movement was always expected. Documents about funding for the trial show a one-off £500 set-up payment, a lump sum of £1,099 to cover start-up staffing, and then 60p per pupil per day, with free school meal pupils attracting an extra 78p. Further details and comment can be found on Schools Week online. In Namibia, the BBC reports that new President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah has scrapped university fees from 2026. Addressing lawmakers, Nandi-Ndaitwah said that students would pay no registration or tuition fees at all public universities and technical colleges. However, she did say that there would be no significant extra funding, which raised questions about the feasibility of the scheme. The only contribution as families and students for now will be towards accommodation and other costs, she said. Primary and secondary education is already free in all Namibia's public schools. Further details can be found on the BBC News website at bbcafrica.com. FE Week features a new report on Level 2 apprenticeships, which urges the government to scrap them and replace them with foundation apprenticeships. Professor David Phoenix, Vice-Chancellor of London South Bank University, wrote a policy paper for the Higher Education Policy Institute. In it, he argues that apprenticeships in their current form are encouraging employer investment in higher level skills at the expense of entry levels. He also says evidence suggests that Level 2 apprenticeships have not offered high quality education and training, nor been sufficiently accessible to potential learners. He said the government's decision to introduce foundation apprenticeships, due to launch this autumn, presents the opportunity to address the situation. Changes to the system, he says, would free up funding so it could be used in a more strategic and nuanced approach. Full details and comment on the report, the new apprenticeships themselves, and issues around funding can be found in FE online. Finally, the BBC reports that a primary school in Aberdeenshire had to close for a week after a single rat was found. The rat forced 125 pupils to learn from home whilst a deep clean was carried out. The rat was not available for comment. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Welcome back to our show on narrative non-fiction in the primary history classroom with teacher and researcher Dr. Emma Simpson. In the first section of the show, Emma described her early teaching career and her enthusiasm for primary teaching. Now, Emma, I'd like to explore the findings of your history research with you in a bit more depth. What drew you to narrative in history teaching as the focus of your study in the first place?
I think, firstly, what drew me to narrative is I've just always, again, been interested in narrative. I've always been a reader of narratives myself. And during my undergraduate course, my BA, my dissertation, which was also my first publication, was about narrative in the teaching of evolution. And I became quite interested in narrative as a tool to teach topics that were quite distant and quite unfamiliar to learners, and helping learners to understand these more abstract concepts. So I kind of wanted to build on that previous research that I'd completed before. And what drew me specifically to history next were my experiences in the classroom. So my first teaching job was with a Year 6 class, and they could be quite a challenging class in terms of their behaviour. And I would teach them an hour-long history lesson in an afternoon about World War II, which was our topic at the time. And the history lesson would go well, they were all engaged and interested, and at the end of the day, I would read them 10 minutes of our class text, which was a text called Once by the author Morris Gleitzman. And the text is all about a young Jewish boy whose parents put him in a Catholic orphanage at the beginning of World War II. And the story follows him escaping from this orphanage and navigating through Poland when it was occupied by Germany at the time. And when we had these 10 minutes of reading at the end of the day, my class would kind of draw their chairs around my desk and really come in close. And it was the 10 minutes of the day where I knew that without any effort other than reading this story, I could have everyone's full attention, everybody fully immersed in the story. And we would have discussions as we went about what was happening in the text, and just the interest of my students at the time and the collaborative discussions that we had. It did make me feel like they were learning a lot more from that 10-minute read compared to the entire history lesson that I had taught them. So I think that experience in the classroom drew me specifically to begin thinking about history and the impact that narrative might have on history. And when I began thinking a little bit more about that, it's interesting that history is a subject really that does naturally lend itself to narrative in so many ways, just because history is essentially a sequence of events, and a narrative does describe to us a sequence of events. So they kind of naturally seem to go together quite well. But also, I found that narrative contradicts history in many ways, because narratives we often associate with fictional content. And the idea of fictional content when we're teaching a subject such as history, which is very content-based, and we have this kind of set of ideas, this set of knowledge that we want to impart upon students. So the idea of teaching that through a narrative which is associated with fiction seems like a bit of a contradictory idea. So I think all of that kind of made me start thinking about whether narrative could actually complement history.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. It takes us, I suppose, to the heart of that philosophical question about whether children are learning truth or untruth through fiction, and whether there's a kind of bigger truth that can be grasped even when you're dealing with kind of semi-fictional elements of a narrative. How did students respond to that tension?
Yeah, I think it's tricky, but I think it's a really great process for students to go through, because they have got to kind of grapple with, what am I going to take away from this text, and what do I need to understand is fictional. But I think that does promote quite a lot of critical thinking and discussion about what is happening in a text. So it really is quite engaging for them to have that debate about filtering out which information they want to take from the text and which they don't. And as you said, I think sometimes when we're learning about history, we can get very caught up on kind of the small little details and ensuring that they're factual, whereas sometimes learning about history is about just gaining that larger picture of what it could have been like. And as students get more interested in the topic and learn more about it, that's when they can come down to those smaller details and really figure out and get to grips with which parts might be entirely factual and which parts might be fabricated for a narrative.
Thank you. And in terms of your literature review, there's something I might need you to explain to me, because it's something I'm not familiar with. You suggest that Van Dyke and Kinch have found that readers construct 3 levels of mental representation of the text as they interact with it: the surface model, the text base, and the situation model. Could you tell us a little bit about this idea and how it relates to your study and the kind of reading you think children were doing in the room with you?
Yes, of course. So basically, what Van Dyke and Kinch suggest is that whenever a text is read, we construct multiple different levels of mental representation as a reader. So the first level of mental representation they call the surface form, and that is just a mental representation of the exact wording of a text. So obviously this representation decays quite quickly in memory. We don't remember for a long time the exact words that we've read. The second level they call the text base, And this is kind of a representation of the text itself. It's a representation of the propositions in the text and the relations between these. And this really focuses on the linguistic content of the text and the underlying structure of the text. And finally, we construct the situation model. Now, this model represents the situations and events that are in a text, but it also combines it with our prior knowledge as a reader. So the situation model is thought to be episodic in nature. It's kind of almost like a little mini micro world, containing the characters, their goals, and what happens to these characters. And this situation model is the part that I'm interested in, because it's really where we can think perhaps of learning as occurring because of that infusion of what the reader has read with any prior knowledge that they are bringing to that. So that is really where the reader is making sense of the text and interpreting it themselves. So it relates to my research because I'm quite interested in how I believe situation models might be constructed differently in response to different types of text. So in response to a narrative text, a situation model may be structured quite differently to the kind of situation model that we construct when we are reading a non-fiction text, for example. And there may be differences in how we infuse our prior knowledge in these different types of situation models that we construct.
So are you looking to keep most of your children's reading then functioning within the level of the situation model, or were you expecting them to move backwards and forwards between each of the three?
I think there is movement backwards and forwards between the three as they adapt and update. So there's a constant updating of the different levels as they're reading.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And in terms of how you set the project up, what exactly was it that you were asking your children to do?
So essentially, I had a intervention session with each of the groups of children. So I had a narrative intervention, a narrative non-fiction intervention, and an expository or non-fiction intervention. And in each intervention session, I would do a couple of activities with the children just to activate relevant prior knowledge. When we're talking about World War I, for instance, the first text was about how war began. And we had concepts such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And as soon as children would hear that or read about that, they might switch off. So we had some activities just looking at maps to get them familiar with vocabulary like that. And after the prior knowledge activities, I read them either the narrative non-fiction text or the expository text. And after that, they had some discussion questions, which they spoke about in small groups, which were recorded. My current publication focuses on some assessments that they did later, but something that I'm working on at the moment will go into those discussions that the children had together in more details. So they completed those intervention sessions, and after the intervention sessions were complete, they sat an assessment, a post-assessment, and 6 weeks later, they sat a delayed post-assessment, which looked at assessing what they had learned during those intervention sessions. And they also sat, I should have started with, a pre-assessment before any of the interventions took place.
Thank you. And I understand you had to generate both the narrative non-fiction and the expository texts for your experiment. What issues did you have to consider as you went about designing these?
Yeah, I'd say that this was one of the most complex but also enjoyable processes throughout my research. So one of the key difficulties in constructing these two different types of texts was making the texts comparable, in that there weren't too many differences that could make the readers respond in different ways, yet also make them distinct as narrative non-fiction texts and expository texts. So, for example, to make them comparable, I had to make sure that all of the content was the same across the text. All of that kind of key content that I wanted them to learn from was the same across texts. I also had to make sure that it was in the same order. I also had to make sure that the texts were the same length and also the same complexity. There's a tool that I used online which analyzes the complexity as a text and gives you a kind of a number to show how complex it is. So making sure that both of the texts matched up in terms of those different features, yet were also unique and identifiable as narrative nonfiction, as expository, was quite a challenge. With that, it was very difficult to figure out exactly which features I wanted to use to make the narrative nonfiction a narrative text and the expository text an expository text. There are many definitions of narrative out there, but it's quite difficult to unpick exactly what makes a narrative a narrative. So I had to figure out those particular features that I wanted to differentiate it as a narrative. And one of those main features was the presence of some form of protagonist, some kind of character that we can follow throughout the narrative. And this was quite tricky to include a protagonist when writing narrative nonfiction texts. So, for example, in the text that I had about the beginning of World War, it was very difficult to have a key protagonist that you could follow because obviously there were various different events that were occurring, and I could have no protagonist who could kind of see all and be immersed in all of these events. I did have a key protagonist in the text about life in the trenches, and because I was writing narrative nonfiction, this took a lot of research to ensure that it was accurate. So I found a short book made up of letters from a soldier called Harry Stinton, and it was diary entries and letters, and this was his experience in the trenches. So I had to kind of read through this information and be able to take parts from that to use in the narrative to accurately reflect his experience and keep it factual to how he portrayed his experiences, and then translate that into kind of an equivalent expository text.
So it sounds like quite a complicated process and a lot of thinking went into it. What did the pupils already know about World War One, and how did the pupils interact with the text that you compiled for them?
It was interesting to explore what the pupils already knew about World War One because there was such a vast difference between some pupils' knowledge compared to others. So the pre-assessment that we did showed generally pupils didn't know a huge amount about World War One. There was a mean score of about 3.82 overall out of about 56. So generally their knowledge of World War One wasn't great, but you would have specific pockets of children who obviously had quite an interest in that area who would score a little bit higher. And again, as I said, with the prior knowledge activities that I did before reading them the text, that did help to activate some prior knowledge in those children who really didn't have a huge amount of understanding about World War One. Sorry, I've forgotten the second part of the question now that I've got that far.
Sorry, I was going to ask how the pupils interacted with the text that you'd set for them.
Yes. So I did read the text to the pupils, and it was interesting trying to observe. They did seem to be engaged in the text and interested in the texts. And what was very interesting was listening to their discussions afterwards about the texts to really see how they were trying to develop an understanding of those texts and how they would talk collaboratively. So whilst me reading the text to them was quite a passive process for them, they had more of an active interaction with discussions with each other after reading the texts.
And did enough of the elements of your First World War protagonists survive into the text for them to engage with?
Yes, I believe they did, and it was interesting actually. Lots of the children would come up to me after we'd finished the intervention sessions, and they'd say, "So what happened to Harry? Did he survive in the trenches?" And they wanted to know more. They wanted to know more about his story. So I think that was really interesting to see that they were invested in this protagonist. And I think the fact that they knew that this was a real person perhaps made that even more powerful, that they wanted to know what happened to him. They were cheering him on.
Did Harry survive the war?
He did survive the war, I believe. So they were very happy with that.
Excellent. And how did you assess the two groups of pupils? You've mentioned about the baseline test you've done already. And how was this assessment constructed?
Again, constructing it was quite tricky. I firstly had to go back to really thinking of what a conceptual understanding of history was, in terms of thinking exactly what I wanted to measure. So I broke down a conceptual understanding of history. We have one strand of that is our historical knowledge, basically just our understanding of history. And that can be broken into two different subsections. We've got our substantive knowledge, which is essentially just our knowledge of the facts. And then we've got second order knowledge, which is more to do with our understanding and of feelings and emotions and our empathy relating to characters in history. So this assessment focused more on the substantive knowledge, what facts they could learn from these texts. The other strand of the conceptual understanding of history is those historical thinking skills. So the thinking skills that children are using to develop this substantive knowledge. And that was broken down into conceptual thinking, so the children's ability to think about these abstract, distant notions, and chronological thinking, and also causal thinking. So when I looked at the assessments, I knew that I wanted them to look at substantive knowledge, and within that, I knew that I wanted it to consider conceptual thinking, chronological thinking, and causal thinking. So I took elements out of the text that fit into each of those categories to design questions based around. I then had a pilot group of children who I read the text to, and then who sat the assessments, just to see how they got on with them. And I had some year 4 and 5 teachers read through the assessments as well, to see whether they thought that the assessments were appropriate for the age of children who would be sitting them. And from the answers of the children and the comments of the teachers, the assessments were adapted slightly, and I also adapted a mark scheme to try and make it work for the kind of children who would be sitting the assessments.
And how did you ensure it tested what you wanted it to test? How did you make sure you factored out all of the other issues like EAL knowledge or prior existing knowledge, all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, this was a really tricky one to do. So in terms of things like prior knowledge, I looked when I did my assessments very much at the progress from the pre-assessments to the post-assessments, rather than the scores on the post-assessments as kind of the final score. So I could look at that development of knowledge as opposed to just the final scores at the end. Because the prior knowledge was something which was very difficult to control for in that way. And in terms of children with various difficulties or literacy difficulties, or children who did have English as a second language or an additional language, children could be read the assessments as well to support them in this. And when I analysed the data at the end, once they'd sat all of the assessments, I did pick out groups of children to look carefully at, just to see what kind of impact the written assessments might have had on them and the development of their learning. So I think in terms of constructing the assessments themselves, it was more about how the assessments were sat and the support that was put in place for those children at the time that they were sitting them.
Thanks, Emma. It sounds like a lot of thinking went into the assessment methodology, which always seems to be an issue in history teaching, I think. Whether to go broad and shallow or narrow and deep, whether you're better getting extended writing out of students or short answer questions. All of that stuff that we see later come back in public exams in the secondary sector seems to also be at work in your thinking around how to test these children on their knowledge of the First World War. If I think back to my experience of middle school history in Year 5, it's dominated in my mind by making a ceramic mosaic of a Roman centurion. I seem to remember doing that, looking at the engineering miracles that brought Roman bathhouses to Britain, and learning how Roman legionaries dressed for battle. I mean, these lessons have lingered long in my mind and are perhaps the reason why I think about the Roman Empire, to coin a phrase, at the very least monthly. I'm not sure I would have gained the same affection for Roman history simply through our black and white 80s textbooks. In the final section of the show, Emma, I'd like to consider the findings of your research in a bit more detail and their wider implications for curriculum design. And we'll be right back after this.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads, no distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded program helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
Welcome back to the final part of our show on non-fiction narratives and history teaching with Emma Simpson. So far, we've considered Emma's experience of the primary classroom and her research into the narrative as well-established vehicle for effective teaching. I wonder if we might explore your findings on the impact of narrative non-fiction in primary teaching now, Emma, in the classrooms you studied. What were the findings of your study?
So some of the key findings of my study were that those children who were exposed to the narrative non-fiction text, they scored higher on the delayed post-assessment. So they seemed to retain more understanding of World War I after 6 weeks had passed. There were also differences in terms of how the narrative nonfiction and expository groups scored on the specific text relating to trench life, which was interesting. There were 3 different texts. So there were texts on how war began, there was a text on life in the trenches, and there was a text on life on the home front. And it was on the trench life text and questions relating to that children in the narrative non-fiction condition did score significantly more highly, both on the post and the delayed post assessment. So it seems that they developed a greater understanding in response to the narrative non-fiction text, and they also retained this in the longer term.
And did you have any hypotheses about why that might be?
Yes, I did. I wonder whether I could read you a section from the expository text and the narrative non-fiction text from the trench life texts, because this might help to give a bit of an insight when I talk about my theories on why there might have been these differences. Would that be okay?
Yes, please do.
Thank you. Okay, I will start with the narrative text. So we have, the following night, Harry stood on the firing step in the trench, peering out over the eerie darkness of no man's land, looking for danger. This was Harry's first ever sentry duty. As sentry, it was his responsibility to guard the trench from enemy soldiers. The edge of the trench, in front of his eyes, was ragged from shell fire. Harry peeked warily through the twisted tangle of barbed wire, which was all that separated him and the trench from no man's land. His feet and legs shivered with cold. They had been soaked with the wet mud of the trench floors on his walk to the firing step. He was lucky that he hadn't got trench foot, yet. This was a painful infection which caused soldiers' feet to swell and hurt because of the cold, wet conditions. Doctors gave soldiers whale oil to rub on their feet to try to prevent trench foot. And I'll move on to the kind of equivalent paragraph from the expository text now, which begins with the subheading of sentry duty. During the night, soldiers stood on the firing step in the trenches to watch out over the dark no man's land and to look for danger. This was called sentry duty, and it was the sentry's responsibility to guard the trench from enemy soldiers. The edge of the trench was ragged from shell fire, and the soldier had to look through the tangled barbed wire which separated them and the rest of the trench from no man's land. Soldiers usually had very cold feet and legs. They were often soaked with the wet mud of the trench floors on their walk to the firing step. Many soldiers suffered from trench foot. This was a painful infection which caused soldiers' feet to swell and hurt because of the cold, wet conditions in the trenches. Doctors gave soldiers whale oil to rub on their feet to try to prevent them from getting trench foot. So that was the equivalent section from the expository. So hopefully that should give a little insight into exactly what kind of text the children were reading.
Yeah, the difference is subtle, isn't it? But the repositioning really does change the nature of the whole text.
Yes, and I think that was one of the key things which I think had an impact. If I talk first of all specifically about the difference in children's understanding and learning from those trench life texts, I think that the presence of that protagonist, having Harry, really was he almost acts as a vehicle to transport children into the text, enabling them to gain an understanding of this kind of really distant, unfamiliar concept. There's something about narrative that when we construct these situation models in response to narrative, when we construct these mental representations of the world that the narrative is portraying, that we can, through the eyes of a protagonist, really almost imagine ourselves in that situation. And we can leave behind the constraints of our reality in order to do so and to gain a greater understanding of what is happening in the text. And I think having that protagonist greatly enabled this.
And did you have any further findings for your study beyond the role of the protagonist?
In terms of the retention of understanding, so as I said, the narrative non-fiction group, they retained their understanding at a greater level 6 weeks after they'd had exposure to the final text that they read. And I think this is related to the structure of the situation models that we construct in response to narrative texts. So one of the other subtle differences between the texts was simply in terms of the references to time. So in the Trench Life text, we might have the following night in our narrative text versus during the night in the expository text. So it gives us a more specific time frame in which events are happening and what is sometimes referred to as kind of human time rather than just clock time. We're not just given dates, we've got our events sequenced together. And this encourages us as readers to kind of process the text using our episodic memory. Lots of people, when we think of episodic memory, we think of it as relating to events that are personal to us, things that we've experienced. But we actually often use our episodic memory to interpret anything which involves a sequence of events, whether we've experienced them or not. So it draws on this specific type of memory, which has been seen in other instances to actually support our memory of what has been happening in texts. So I think that specific processing of the narrative nonfiction text can support the retention of the information that we read in that. It may alternatively, or alongside that, relate to the strength of the situation models that we create in response to a text. I think one of my main theories is when we read a narrative text, we create a situation model which is called elsewhere and which I've begun calling a story world. And we have this kind of cohesive story world which contains all of the information that we have just learned about World War I in this instance. And it kind of represents that period in history to us. When we read expository texts, our situation models that we construct are more what I call conceptual models. The information is kind of thematically linked. So it might occasionally link to bits of prior knowledge that we already know, but the information is almost segmented into more thematic areas, which makes it a bit trickier for us to remember in the long term, rather than when it's all cohesively stored in one situation model.
And did you notice when you were looking at the narrative nonfiction group any particular clusters or themes of recalled facts or recalled knowledge that surprised you in any way?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think there were certain areas where they did retain more, and they did tend to be based around a character. So, for example, in the text about how war began, many of them did recall a lot of information about Gavrilo Princip and the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in the narrative nonfiction text. But again, that kind of section just it makes a great narrative in itself. And I think the narrative there just pulls all of that information together for a learner to then be able to retrieve it and talk about it, or in this case, answer questions based on it. So I think that was one area where I did notice that the narrative group, even though statistically at the end, overall, they didn't learn more on the War Begins, from the War Begins text. That was one where there were certainly lots of strong answers in relation to that.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea as well, actually. So clearly the students really responded well, by the sound of it, to the individual experience of Harry and his individual story. How well did they catch on to the kind of macro story, if we like, of warring empires as being at the heart of the World War I conflict?
Yeah, that was certainly a lot trickier for them to develop that understanding. And I'm not too sure whether it's because it doesn't necessarily fit into as neat a narrative, or whether it is due to children of that age just struggling to understand those wider implications. And I think this is something which is quite big in the history curriculum, is actually getting children to understand that cause and effect, especially when it's on a much larger scale. Obviously, they can see cause and effect in front of them and process that, but trying to understand kind of these huge events and the knock-on events that they can cause, I think is something which is quite tricky. So in discussions with the children, I was impressed with how well they got to grips with that, but obviously on the written assessments, that didn't kind of come through so much.
Yeah, I wonder if it'd be interesting at a later stage possibly to test their understanding of, say, the story of Britain or the story of Germany or even the story of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What did they make of that vast thing?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it's interesting when I talk about how they responded to kind of chronological understanding. So the children, again, in the narrative nonfiction, a further finding was in the narrative nonfiction text, they did show on a sequencing task that they did a stronger chronological understanding. But obviously this was just dealing with events within a very small period of history. So it's interesting to think about how that could potentially scale up to understand much longer sequences and time relative to other times, and whether that's something that narrative could be used for, or whether narrative is much better for kind of those small specific events that occur within a specific time.
Yeah, I wonder too about the vastness of the geography, really, actually, that they might have been thinking about, and how they might respond to understanding countries that, of course, no longer exist.
Yes, yeah, that was another challenge, and something which I tried to kind of deal with slightly through those prior knowledge activities. So one of the prior knowledge activities before we read the War Begins texts was they were given a map of Europe at the time, and we identified some of the countries and looked at the positioning of some of the key countries and spoke about the Austro-Hungarian Empire and compared that to countries today. So I think this is, again, a key. I'll move on to this more in a moment when we talk about kind of implications for this in the classroom. But a key takeaway is this research isn't really just saying pick up a narrative and read a narrative and it will support understanding. There is more work that has to go into kind of ensuring that that foundational knowledge is there to enable them to be able to understand and take away from the narrative.
Okay, then, so let's move on to that now, perhaps. What are the implications of your research for classroom practice, do you think, Emma? What particular elements of your research can teachers start to try and put into practice, maybe next week?
I think that one of the key takeaways is thinking, obviously, I promote narrative and I enjoy using narrative in the classroom, and there are ways that my research suggests that it can be used effectively. But I think one of the key takeaways is just thinking carefully about exactly how narrative and expository is being used in the classroom to support learning. So, for example, narrative texts might be chosen when children are learning about something which is quite distant, something quite unfamiliar, because the narrative really allows them to kind of transport into that time, and to kind of, like I said, leave those constraints of their reality behind. So, for example, in my Year 5 classroom, we've just started learning about the Mayans. That's our new topic for this summer term. So one of the first things that we've done is read a text about a boy in a Mayan village. There was no kind of specific historical content in this text that I wanted the children to learn. It was kind of just giving them that way into this historical period, allowing them to kind of transport themselves into it and live in it so that we can then move on and build on with that. So I'd say that using narrative, and it doesn't necessarily have to be narrative nonfiction, 100% factual, using that narrative as kind of a gateway into a topic, especially when that topic is unfamiliar, can be really, really useful. I think alongside that, where expository texts are used, it's important to remember to kind of consolidate these texts to support that retention of understanding after children have read an expository text. We've seen from my research that narrative texts are more memorable and children can recall information for them for longer afterwards. So perhaps when expository texts are used, it's thinking more about how we can go back to the knowledge that we intended children to take from those texts, and how we can really embed that and build on that in the conceptual models that they've created to make sure that that learning is kind of strong and retained in the longer term.
So might one lesson be then to try and, wherever possible, bring these large-scale histories of vast civilizations down to that human level, that individual protagonist or that series of protagonists, so that the socio-economic and cultural political factors seem to have a kind of substance rather than abstract quality?
Yeah, 100%. I think so. And I think that's the thing. This is kind of creating that that first step for understanding this historical period. And I think so often in history, we can, especially as teachers, get weighed down by the amount that we are supposed to be teaching and the amount of knowledge that we are trying to impart. So sometimes it is taking that time to just step back and give that, yeah, as you said, that more social view of what it was like to be in a time, that more general view and feel of what a time would have been like to exist within.
And of course, you've given us quite a detailed discussion of how you planned your assessment to check what was retained by your students. Have you any guidance to give on how best to construct a history text that will, or a history test, that will do what you wanted to do?
Sorry, a history test or a history text?
A history test, an assessment.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one because for the purposes of my research, I used a test to evaluate historical knowledge, but it is so much more than kind of those written answers on a piece of paper. I think one thing that came through when I was designing my tests, which would be important for constructing tests on history, is giving a level of openness for children really to expand on and to explain their thoughts. We have a lot of kind of what date did a certain thing happen and that recall of knowledge. But again, really allowing children to give their own explanations on what they know and more open-ended questions for them to be able to express their understanding of a historical period, I think is really important.
So is it about creating space for the imagination to operate then as well?
Yeah, I think so, which is quite, sometimes, as we said earlier, contradicts the notion of history quite a lot. I'm quite interested in some different perspectives of history. So the realist perspective of history kind of states that there's this real past, and that's kind of the touchstone against which the truth of our historical theories are measured. So we've got this real past, and whatever we believe, we are measuring it against that. But I think it's interesting because we cannot directly perceive the past, and we cannot essentially really always prove what happened in the past and what didn't, because we weren't there. So I think it's interesting to think about the idea of actually children kind of constructing their historical pasts, representing their own perspectives of the past, rather than us kind of just giving them information, this is what happened, this is what happened. Is about children creating their own kind of little historical worlds and versions of what happened in the past, and contextualizing the information that they have, and really gaining that deeper understanding of a period through kind of collaborative and a much more active approach to understanding history.
And will you be engaged in your school in reconstructing your history curriculum anyway as a consequence of having completed your research?
Yeah, I am not currently the lead of history, so I will not be able to actively do that myself. But I think we will be keeping a close eye on kind of any developments in the curriculum following the current review, and seeing where we can adapt history accordingly. I think at the moment, again, it is so packed with so much to be covered. It is a very busy curriculum that lots of our focus is kind of just being able to move through the curriculum. Whereas really what we would like to do is have that freedom to really take a much more explorative approach towards the history curriculum.
And finally, Emma, does the national curriculum need a clearer vision of what history is and how it might be experienced in the primary school classroom, in your view?
Yes, I think it could do with a clearer vision and kind of opening it up more to make it a subject that pupils do more actively engage themselves in. I think that at the moment, lots of it is, there are parts of it about becoming a historian and critical thinking and weighing evidence, whereas I think there could be a lot more relating to kind of experiences of the past. Rather than us having these kind of learners who are just becoming quite kind of passive receivers of knowledge.
And do you think there might be more opportunities for them to go out and find history happening outside their classrooms?
I'm hoping so, and there is a push on kind of local history. I think obviously depending on your locality, that will affect lots of children in different ways. So it would be nice to see children getting out of classrooms more and exploring the history around them. Obviously, with the current state of funding in schools, teachers are perhaps having to become more creative with the ways that they do this. And perhaps more of it is about kind of bringing that history to children through texts such as narrative, so that they can have those experiences of history, even if it isn't an active experience outside of the classroom, even if it is more of an experience in their imagination.
And with your English and IT hat on, what about the notion of virtual visits to some of these historical sites?
Yeah, I think that will be an interesting concept moving forwards. And already as a school, we have a tool that we use, which kind of you can explore these 3D images and kind of tours through different historical sites. And I think that is hugely engaging in bringing history to life and kind of, again, just bridging that gap. History is so distant to us, so having these kind of visual images that we can explore, these narratives that we can explore, is just forming some kind of bridge so that we can support children in that kind of abstract thinking to gain that concept of something which otherwise they can have no actual experience with.
Well, thank you very much, Emma, for your contributions, for sharing your research, your experience and your passion for a dynamic primary curriculum with us this evening. I was particularly struck, as you were talking, by your discussion of the ways in which students can retain quite complex information once they engage their imaginations and can visualize the events of big historical narratives at the level of individual people. It sounds like a very exciting way forward indeed. I've learnt a lot about how we might think about the upper primary school child as a history learner in the course of our conversation. And perhaps this might give us pause to think in the secondary school about how we best prepare incoming students to make a smoother transition from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 each September. It's been great to have your company this evening. Thank you very much for all of your contributions tonight, Emma. I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer term and whatever plans you have for your students in the final months of the academic year.
Thank you so much. It's been really interesting talking to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And that just about brings us to the end of another Sunday Late Show on Teachers Talk Radio, the home of education conversation. I hope you found this evening's show inspiring and informative, and that you might, if you haven't already done so, find the time to subscribe to our Teachers Talk Radio social media accounts, leave a review of our shows on your preferred podcast provider, or consider getting in touch with a request to appear as one of our guests. If you'd like to appear as a guest on my show, you're always welcome to contact me on my Twitter handle, which is @C for Christopher, G for George, Vowles, VOWLES. If you are a classroom-based teacher or have some other close connection to the teaching profession, then we would love to hear from you. So check out our website at www.ttradio.org and give us the opportunity to put your voice on the air. Thanks again to Dr. Emma Simpson for tonight's show, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in tonight, some from as far away as the United States. Do check out our other Teachers Talk radio shows this week. We have a number of new hosts continuing to make their debuts, so look up the schedule on our website and give them a listen if you can. This week and every week on Teachers Talk Radio, there is simply so much content to engage with from real teachers working with real students in real schools. You can find anything you've missed of the 2,500 shows so far at www.ttradio.org. And if you have something you want to say or ask others about education anywhere on planet Earth, then perhaps you should consider applying to join the station as a show host. We are always on the lookout for those with current or recent experience of the classroom and other less familiar educational settings. Full details can be found on our website, www.ttradio.org. That's all from me for this evening, so thank you for listening, and we will speak again in May. Goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.